Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Linguistic Society. My name is Serdar Servet. I'm a linguistics student here in Mersin University. This month, we will be focusing on forensic linguistics, and we have a wonderful guest, Professor Tim Grant from Ashton University. I would like to give the word to Ferlin, our president. Ferlin.
Thank you, Sardar. Hello, everyone. Welcome again. As you know, we dedicated January to forensic linguistics. It is not only a subfield of linguistics, but also important. It is important and beneficial for the society we live in. And we observed that it has been gaining popularity among college students in Turkey. And we thought it would help us gain and learn about forensic linguistics. And today we have a special guest from Ashton University. Professor Tim Grant is here with us, and he's going to share his recent publication called The Idea of Progress in Forensic Authorship Analysis. From now on, I would like to give the word to Mr. Grant himself, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to, I think, this is the first time I've spoken in Turkey, I think, and I look forward to being able to travel in person on another occasion, maybe, but we shall see. I'm going to go straight to my presentation now, and just making sure that it will all work. And then is that now presenting properly to you? Can someone say out loud, because everyone's disappeared for me? Yeah, brilliant.
Everything is proper.
Thank you very much indeed. So yes, as Ferlin said, the title I've taken for today's talk is The Idea of Progress in Forensic Authorship Analysis. And this is also the title of a short book that I've just written, which is actually available free to download. I'll give the link at the end of the talk if anyone wants to follow up on these ideas by reading the piece. So what I do in this piece is look at and discuss the nature of forensic authorship analysis in the context of other forensic sciences. In the UK and in America and maybe in Australia, forensic authorship analysis is increasingly presented as evidence in court. But its status is still that of a relatively new forensic science. And as such, it can be questioned, and its status can be questioned. And also, as we'll see as I progress with my talk, a lot of older, more established forensic sciences also have questions to answer as to whether they should be accepted in court or not. And I want to sort of address some of those questions today. I'm going to start with a case from 2004, which was my first big case as a forensic linguist. So this case sorry, I've got a strange message come up. No, I think that's okay. This was a case from nearly 20 years ago, and what happened is I was just finished my PhD in 2004, and I got a phone call from a police office, and they were actually looking for my ex-PhD supervisor, Malcolm Coulthard, but he was out of the country. And so I ended up taking this case, and the police had arrested a suspected terrorist, Diran Barot, who's British born, but was thought to head up Al-Qaeda in the UK at the time. And this is only 3 years after the Twin Towers attacks in America and so on and so forth. So everyone was very concerned about Islamist terrorism. And they'd arrested Barot on the basis of some intelligence that he had written a document called The Rough Cut to the Gas Limo Project. And but they didn't have evidence that would be admissible in court to convict him. So there's this big distinction in English legal cases of what you might know about someone and what you can prove in a court case. And so the authorities believed that he had written this document, but they could not show so they did not find it on him. They did not find anything that they could tie to him to say that he had written this document. And so someone phoned up and said, can we show that he'd written this gas limo project document using linguistic analysis? And I've put the timeline of what happened there. It was a very hurried case. So on the 12th of August of 2004, I received this phone call, and we had to complete everything by the 14th of August, because under English law, if they didn't have evidence enough to take him to court by the 16th of August, then Duran Boroch would have had to be released. So it was in a hurry. It's the only time I've had a ride in a fast police car with all the lights going, and we analysed these documents in New Scotland Yard in the middle of London, and it was all very, very exciting. I've got a small group of us together. The full story is there in the written text, and that was sort of, for me, the start of my career as a caseworker, but also it was pretty early in the days of forensic linguistics as evidence in court, as used by the prosecution in the UK. And when I look back on that case now, as you might hope, that I think, oh, we could have done a better job. We should have done it this way. We might have done it differently. And those kind of thoughts, I think, are important. We should be reflective and critical of our own work. But that led me thinking about forensic linguistics more generally, and whether there has been anything like progress, anything we could call about improvement in doing authorship analysis cases. And that's what the book sets out to examine. Okay, and the presentation's behaving a little bit oddly. Let's move that out of the way. Okay, so when you start thinking about ideas of progress in science or in culture, or even on long timescales about civilization, or on personal timescales like, have I progressed as a forensic linguist or as a linguist more generally? You've got to ask, what does this idea of progress mean? And there's a strain of philosophy of science that asks just that question. And it's sort of, there's an important writer called Robert Nisbet who writes a book called The History of the Idea of Progress in 1980. And his idea is that knowledge about things has a special status as a form of knowledge. And it's a very different sort of knowledge from, for example, knowledge within a relationship about your partner, or spiritual knowledge, because knowledge about can accumulate over time and be passed between generations. And he says there are other forms of knowledge, but the idea of progress is based on this special form of knowledge, which is essentially scientific knowledge, knowledge about things. And around, so he's writing in the context of other philosophers of science who talk about accumulating knowledge, but also scientific revolutions, and how knowledge from one science can be incommensurable with knowledge from another science. So Thomas Kuhn in the 1960s was writing about how quantum physics is incommensurable with classical physics. So the physics of Isaac Newton and so on can't be, you can't talk about the ideas from that when you're discussing quantum physics and so on. But these ideas in the philosophy of science end up with the idea of demonstrable truths. And this is the main philosophy of science idea that I want to talk about in terms of the idea of progress. So this knowledge about, this scientific knowledge, depends on external demonstration that something is true. So I can demonstrate the truth of a proposition to you. And this is an interesting idea to me, because that's exactly what we're trying to do in a court case as well. We're trying to demonstrate the truth of our assertions in court. And so this is where I think science and forensic evidence intersect in this idea of demonstrable truths. Okay. So let's think about forensic authorship analysis. So when you're thinking about any discipline, so first, I will get into more detail of authorship analysis, but as with the Deer and Baroque case, the basic idea is demonstrating in a court, that's the forensic bit, demonstrating in a court who wrote a document. So is it the defendant, or you might be trying to demonstrate that it wasn't the defendant based on their written style. And we're not talking about their handwriting, we're talking about their word selection and the grammar that they use and the way they express themselves. And in the UK, at least, this starts in 1965 with work of Jan Svartvik, actually a Swedish linguist, but working in the UK, who was asked to examine a confession statement in a famous case in Britain. It's a famous miscarriage of justice where an individual called Timothy Evans confessed to the murder of his wife and child, and it later turned out that he hadn't committed those murders. And so there was a public inquiry which said, well, how could this false confession have arisen? And Svartvik was asked to do a linguistic analysis of the confession statement. And what he said is that he observed linguistic discrepancies in the confession statement. And what he said is, or what he surmised is, or inferred, what he concluded was that the sections of the confession which were most incriminating contained a different sort of grammatical style from the general sections of the confession. And the idea that was picked up was that those sections were in fact written by the police officers interviewing Timothy Evans rather than by Timothy Evans themselves. So that Timothy Evans hadn't in fact confessed to the murder of his wife and child, and this had contributed to the miscarriage of justice. So what's interesting about this piece is, and there's a very short sort of book or pamphlet on this case, which can be found online, is Jan Svartvik wrote it up as an academic monograph, which he called the Evans Statement, a case for forensic linguistics. And so in 1965 or in 1968, publishing this book, Jan Svartvik coined the name forensic linguistics for this new linguistics discipline in English. There are other terms in other languages, but in the English-speaking world, this was the first use of the term forensic linguistics. Forensic linguistics at the time was already well developed in Germany. So Hannes Knifke, who still, he's mostly retired now, but is still an academic in Germany, was taking cases throughout the 1970s, and he reports these cases in this book in 2007. And amongst the early cases he reports, there are 3 cases of authorship analysis. And what he says is that he takes various linguistic features, including grammatical features, the morphology, syntax, lexicon, and word order, and also linguistic and pragmatic features, idiosyncrasies, special usages, errors, and deviations, all as evidence who wrote something. So what we've got here is the idea that any writer will do some things fairly consistently across texts that we can recognize as their writing style, as their authorial style. And Knifke was using this kind of insight, looking at German language texts mostly, a few analyses in other languages too, throughout the 1970s, effectively performing forensic authorship analysis, as these analyses then ended up to resolve court cases, and some of them went to court in Germany. If we jump forward from the 1970s to the 1980s, Professor Malcolm Coulthard in Birmingham here, but at the University of Birmingham across the city, got involved in a series of court cases, a bit like the Jan Svartvik case, where police officers were accused of writing corrupt witness statements. And there were what turned out to be a corrupt police unit investigating serious crime in the city of Birmingham in the UK at that time. And there were many cases where individuals were said to have confessed to certain crimes, when in fact this wasn't the case. The police officers had effectively coerced them to sign false confessions where the police officers had written those confession statements for the suspects of the crime. Malcolm Coulthard developed forensic linguistics in the UK, and he was also very interested in corpus methods in linguistics, and his analyses include the first corpus linguistic methods in forensic linguistics as well. Also in the 1980s, we have the growth of forensic linguistics in America. The first case in the United States is this case cited on this slide, and it's interesting because it involved a huge number of linguists. No fewer than 5 experts were involved in the case. Jerry McMenamin and Ed Finnegan are perhaps the most famous linguists who are still working in forensic linguistics, but Richard Bailey and others are names that you might have heard of if you've read from that era of American linguists. They're all high-profile linguists in the United States at the time. And McMenamin provided evidence, and then the others were brought in either to critique McMenamin's evidence or to back it up. And so, like I said, there were 5 linguists involved. And interestingly, although it was the first use in the US of forensic linguistic evidence that I could find looking through the case histories, it was also then legally, the whole case was what the American legal system says vacated, which means for other reasons, nothing to do with the linguistic analysis, it was as if the case had never existed legally. So it was the first use, and also there's some sense in which it never happened. Perhaps the most famous American forensic linguistics case is Jim Fitzgerald's case, which is the Unabomber investigation. And there's an American series up on Netflix called Manhunt the Unabomber, which is a fictional account of this investigation. It's not all true, but in this investigation, as an FBI agent, Fitzgerald investigated writings of a domestic terrorist in the United States who was putting bombs on aeroplanes and sending bombs to university departments, which is why it became known as the Unabomber. And the account of how that case was investigated and resolved, and led to the conviction of Ted Kaczynski. It's quite a famous case in forensic linguistics. So you get this growth of forensic linguistics across different countries. We had a seminar, an online seminar we held here at Aston, and we got information about all sorts of different jurisdictions where forensic linguistics has been used in court. There are some reporting restrictions in Turkey, but we do know that there have been cases for forensic authorship analysis in Turkish courts as well. It's difficult for those involved to publish full details of the cases in Turkey, I understand. But these are sort of publicly available cases in the United States, Germany, and the UK. Okay, so what does forensic authorship analysis include? So if you look down the left-hand side of this slide, I think there are 3 main areas that forensic authorship analysis includes. There's what we call comparative authorship analysis, there's sociolinguistic profiling, and there's a new area which I refer to as author search. So comparative authorship analysis is where you have some known texts from an author, so documents or writings that you absolutely know that they have written, and then you have an anonymous text or a disputed text, and you're saying from the known text, can we tell whether it's the same author? So in the Diran Barot case, we had all sorts of known texts that he had written to compare with the conspiracy document, the gas limo project document. The known text included all sorts of things like school essays, but it also included sort of more adult writings of insurance claims at airports and job applications and various other documents and things he had written. And he was known to have written them. And we were asked to do a comparison between those documents and the gas limo project to say what was the likelihood that the gas limo project had the same authorship as that set of documents. And that's a comparative authorship analysis. And that's what we would call an open set authorship verification task, because there's only one author you're looking at. And the question is it this person, or might it be someone else? So it's a really open case. A closed set task at the top there is where you know a text is written by 2 or 3 authors, 2 or 3 candidate authors, or maybe a larger number, and the task is to work out which of these authors is the most likely writer of the anonymous text, the query text, which is sometimes referred to as the Q document and the known text as K documents. And obviously you can have just 2 possible authors, or maybe fewer than 5 or 5 to 20 authors, and these get harder and harder until they realistically turn into open set authorship problems. Okay. As well as that, there's also what I've labeled here as identification of precursory authorship. So these are where you're comparing 2 texts where there might be an issue of copyright infringement, or plagiarism in an academic context. Has one text been copied from another text? So is one text a precursory text of another text? And that's a different sort of comparative authorship analysis. There's a whole separate area which is known as sociolinguistic profiling. And in this area, there's no suspect text, there's no K documents in the case. All you've got is a query document, and you're reading a text, and it might be, I don't know, it might be a threatening communication, it might be a suicide note or an extortion letter, and you're asked, can you say anything about the writer? Can you say whether they're a man or a woman? Can you say anything about their age, their educational background, their social class, whether they have other languages that affect the language in the text? So if the text is in English, can you read a text in English and say that it was written by someone whose first language is Turkish, for example? That's other language influence detection or native language identification. And similarly, can you say whether this text was written by a teacher or a lawyer or maybe a police officer? Is there evidence of a professional register in the text? So what you're trying to do in these cases is draw up a profile of the author. The final area is a very new area that we've been investigating at Aston, and other people investigate it too, which is called author search queries, which are sometimes called needle in the haystack problems. So this is where, say you have a very large internet forum like Reddit, and you have a few messages by an author, can you find other messages by the same author? Yeah, so can you find them in this haystack? And the idea is, particularly if they may be using different usernames or different logins in the same forum, can you identify all the text written by the same author? So the idea is you're searching amongst a very large number of authors, maybe 100,000 authors, to determine have they written other messages in this online forum. So those are needle in the haystack problems. So these 3 areas, I think, more or less comprise forensic authorship analysis and the types of tasks that we engage in. Okay, how is it done? I'm not going to do a big lecture. Most of the lecture isn't about methods of how to do forensic authorship analysis, but it basically splits into 2 sorts of approaches, which are sometimes called stylistic approaches and stylometric approaches. So stylistic approaches is where you start with the text itself and try and work out what's distinctive about that text, what's salient, what jumps out as you're reading the text that might be idiosyncratic, that might be a marker of authorship style. And you create a list of these markers, and then you show how distinctive they are, and then look for them in other texts. It's usually based in a sort of an expert linguist doing a hand analysis. And quite often it won't just be, it will include sort of low-level lexico-grammatical features, spellings, punctuation, word choices, syntactic structures. But just as Hans Knifke said about his analyses in the 1980s, it can also include things like discourse structures or politeness strategies or other aspects of pragmatics. It's not limited as to what those features might be. And very often the decision-making methods are somewhat unclear. So how do you decide whether you've got a match or not a match? And so that can be a critique of these messages. And the sort of general subjectivity is also often critiqued by those who don't like stylistic authorship analyses. On the other side, over here, we have stylometric analyses, which are heavily computational. So the idea is you write computer software which will count the number of uses of a particular word or a particular grammatical structure, will calculate average word lengths, average sentence length, and so on. And there's a whole raft of potential markers of authorship that can be investigated in advance of any particular case and be shown to be reliable, and then applied to any case. So rather than starting with the text in the case, you start off with this, with the software, and it's heavily associated with computational analysis, but most of the features tend to be very low-level features. So they do tend to be word selections and low-level grammatical structures and so on. And an advantage and disadvantage of this is you can use complicated machine learning or artificial intelligence techniques to classify text by one author against another author. And you can also use complex statistical techniques to do the same. And these are often referred to as black box methods, because if you use artificial intelligence, it can be very hard to work out, well, why did the computer come up with a particular conclusion? So I presented these as two alternatives, stylistic methods or stylometric methods, but it is a bit more complicated than that. There's a lot of overlap in the middle, and you can use computational assistance to do stylistic methods, and some stylometric authorship analysis isn't so black box and can include pragmatic methods and so on. But there's this essential split, I think, of ways of carrying out an authorship analysis. Okay, so I want to switch up a little bit just for a few slides and talk about forensic science more generally. So we get lots of TV shows, at least in the UK, looking at sort of crime scene investigation, DNA evidence, fingerprint, blood spatter, footprint evidence, bite mark evidence, all these separate forensic sciences, forensic toxicology, and so on. And what I'd like to suggest is, since the invention of DNA evidence, which was in 1987, the whole of forensic science has been going through a scientific revolution. And the invention of DNA evidence sort of over time has created recognition that there are three essential issues with regard to other forensic sciences than linguistics. We're not talking about linguistics here, but across all forensic science that's not DNA, there's the issue of validating methods. There's the issue of contextual biases that expert witnesses have. And there's the issue of how we should logically present evidence in a courtroom. And I'm going to very quickly talk about each of those before returning to the forensic authorship analysis and seeing how they measure up against each of these issues. Okay, so validation of methods. So when you start looking, when you start thinking about forensic science, the basic question is, how scientific is it? And we know that DNA analysis is very scientific, but when you start looking, what you find is there's not enough research, basic foundational research across the board in forensic sciences. So we've got reports from the United Kingdom in 2019, and reports, this is the Presidential Commission in the United States in 2016. So this is only 5 or 6 years ago now, yeah? Where they're saying that, so for the Presidential Commission, it says in their report, there are sufficient studies to support the foundational validity of DNA analysis. So that means there's basic science in place to support DNA analysis, and maybe fingerprint examination is a lesser validity, but there's no foundational validity in all these other forensic sciences, in bite mark analysis, in firearms analysis, in footwear analysis, or hair analysis, and so on. Yeah, they don't mention linguistics, it's too small a discipline. But what they're saying is there's actually no basic science. There's no knowledge about the amount of variation between individuals, what the population of individuals look like, how to best analyze these in forensic cases. Effectively, they're saying that most forensic science isn't scientific at all. And in the UK, we have had similar reports. So there was a report to the House of Lords, which is our higher chamber of parliament in the United Kingdom, which had similar conclusions and at the end said we need to urgently and substantially increase the amount of dedicated funding allocated to forensic science for foundational research. The research isn't there. So other than DNA and maybe fingerprint evidence, there's not enough basic knowledge. And this is what validation is about. So when we're thinking about forensic authorship analysis, there's a real question which we have to address is what do we know about authorship? What is an author? How much within an author's writings will they vary their style? And how much variation is there between authors? And these kind of questions, we have to do the empirical studies, and we are doing the empirical studies, but we have to do these studies to demonstrate that our analyses are sufficiently robust to stand up in court, that they are indeed scientific in a strong sense of the word. And I think, well, I'll come on to it in a bit, but I think we do okay. We certainly do no worse than other forensic sciences, which have been accepted in court for a long time. Okay, the second of my three issues was about contextual bias. And this is an area of forensic science that has been attracting a lot of study over the last decade or so as well. And maybe the best study, or at least the most cited study, is that by Itiel Draw. And he looked at fingerprint examiners. And what he did is he got a group of fingerprint examiners in the UK who were considered at the top of their field. They were very experienced, very knowledgeable fingerprint examiners. And he gave them pairs of fingerprints to say, do you see that these are matches or are they not matches? So that's the basic task of a fingerprint examiner. Is this fingerprint from the knife, from the crime scene, from the whatever? Does it match the fingerprint of the suspect? That's the basic task, right? And what he did is there was a control condition where there was no context. They were just presented with print A and B and asked to give an analysis. And in the second condition, they provided a story about the origins of the print, which was intended to bias their judgment. Okay. Now, what he didn't tell them is what the prints that he had shown these fingerprint examiners were from their own old cases, where they had already said that there was a strong match or a strong conclusion that they weren't the same. And what Draw was able to show is even with these highly reputable fingerprint examiners under, experimental conditions, the story you told them biased their judgment. And in 2/3 of the cases, they gave contradictory information from their original judgment. So the story made them find a match or deny that there was a match there. Now, you might think that this is a rogue result, but this effect has been demonstrated across many forensic sciences, including, in fact, DNA analysis, that contextual bias, the confirmation bias of forensic experts, is a really important aspect that needs to be accounted for in forensic science. And the basic conclusion here, it's not about being incompetent and it's not about being dishonest. It's that every honest, competent expert witness is subject to contextual biases. We all are. And that's not a criticism of any individuals. And in fingerprint examination, the solution is easy, right? You don't provide any contextual information. You don't tell them about the crime or that this print was lifted from a crime scene and that one is just from something else. You don't tell them anything. Yeah, it's just, here are two prints. Are they a match or not a match? In linguistic analysis, it's a bit harder because the language we analyze, the suicide note or the threatening communication, tells part of the story often. But we need to design ways of doing forensic authorship analysis that takes account of this effect. We know we're all biased according to the story that we're told. The final issue is what the role of the expert witness is. So I've talked about fingerprint examiners providing a match or a non-match opinion. And in the UK and in the United States, in other jurisdictions at least, the role of the expert witness shouldn't be to decide a case by saying this matches or doesn't match. It should be to assist the court in decision making. So what you should do is not provide a percentage probability of a match, but rather provide what's called a likelihood ratio, which describes the weight of the evidence that you've got. So if you think of the linguistic example, there are some very common features which aren't at all distinctive in any text you'll read in English. So inclusion of the word of and the, for example, is in almost every English text. Okay, so there's a high probability of seeing that feature in both a known text and a query text. Okay, but that carries very little weight of evidence. It doesn't tell you anything at all just because it's so common in English. So what you have to do is find features where there's a high probability of seeing the feature in the query text and a low probability of seeing that feature in a relevant population. Okay, so if on the other hand I have an unusual spelling of a particular word, yeah, that unusual spelling, can I show that it's not used by anyone else in this sociolinguistic group? If I can show that, and that it's there in the query text and the known text, then I can say that this evidence has higher weight, a greater weight of evidence. And you can do this. There's a mathematical technique you can do to draw these conclusions, which is called a Bayesian likelihood ratio. And this is recommended by a lot of forensic science academics. There are problems with using it, but you don't have to do the maths so long as you take account of these two hypotheses: the probability of seeing the feature if someone else was the source against the probability of seeing the feature if the defendant was the source. You have to have both the consistency and the distinctiveness in your conclusions. So we've got these three issues. We've got the issue of validation. Is it science at all? We've got the issue of contextual bias, that all experts are biased in all their analyses. And we've got the issue of logically correct inferencing. The question I ask myself is, how have we, forensic linguists, progressed in our authorship analysis work against these three issues? Okay. And if we look at the, sorry, I've lost where I am in my slides. I'm just going to go forward one more. Yeah. So if we look at both stylistic and stylometric methods, you will get slightly different answers. So answers about stylistic methods have been that they're relatively unscientific, yeah, that they're hard to validate. But on the other hand, this is what's used in most court cases worldwide. For the stylometric methods, there are attempts to validate these methods, and there's some progress with very short text that you get in forensic cases, but the main problem is they're really hard to explain the results to the court. So we're talking about demonstrable truth. That's about explaining results, and that can be something that's quite tricky if you use stylometric methods. Okay, I want to leave time for questions, so now I'll talk about this case. So this is a stylometric case that occurred in Birmingham in 2013, where an authorship analysis was rejected by a judge on the basis that the judge couldn't understand it. It couldn't be explained to the court well enough. Now, the analysis may have been correct, but because it was based in a heavily stylometric computational approach, it was hard for the court to understand it. There wasn't sufficient explanation to the court, and for that reason, it was turned out by the judge. Okay, and that's what that slide says as well. Let's move to the next one. So with regard to validation generally, there has been some progress in computational cases. Ainsworth and Yola suggest that work in linguistics provides a model for other forensic sciences. I think that's slightly overclaims, but it's not designed for specifically forensic authorship analysis. And so these kind of competitions in computational work can be used to create validation studies and make sure the science is more secure, but we need to work at this a bit harder, is my conclusion here. With regard to contextual bias, I have proposed in a few writings that we need to think about the structure, how we structure a case, and that there should be a division of labor, and you need at least 2 people to work on any case. So the idea is that you would have a case manager who would have conversations with the police force, learn all about the case, collect the data, make sure there's enough data to answer a case, and then anonymize that data, and then pass it for analysis to a second linguist who would actually perform the analysis itself, where they're passed the language evidence in a case in a way that they say, well, here's some text by person A, here's some text by person B. These are known texts. Do a contrastive authorship analysis to tell us what person A does that's different from person B. And then here are the query texts. Is it more likely to be A or to be B? And if you do that, the idea is you can set up structures to design out the biases that we're all subject to. And so, excuse me. So we are doing this in casework in the UK at the moment, and it's a method of reducing, at least, or mitigating the contextual bias that we have. Okay. We've made less progress in authorship analysis in terms of the logically correct inferencing. And we're doing it qualitatively using the 2 hypothesis method, but there's very few studies that use Bayesian likelihood ratios in authorship analysis. There is an exception, who's this Japanese researcher here. And if you're mathematically minded, I recommend that you read their stuff. It's very useful. Expressions in terms of degrees of consistency and distinctiveness avoid the match non-match thinking and support the twin hypothesis approach. So certainly this is what we're doing, but perhaps there's less progress in that direction. Okay, so where are we at the moment? I think in authorship analysis work, we need more validation studies. We need validation methods on forensically realistic texts, and we need validation of protocols for answering case questions, and we need validation across languages. One language will have different opportunities for authorship analysis than another language. And if we do this work, we can also answer on protocols, we can also answer questions of contextual bias and the question of the logically correct inferencing. And all this work is going on. We're doing a lot of it at Aston, but also it's going on with different forensic linguists around the world working on these kind of questions. My last thought is about the Diran-Barot case. We didn't do any of these things. There was no validation. We were subject to huge biases, and there was a weak consideration of how we were presenting our data logically, our conclusions logically. So I think we're a lot better than we were nearly 20 years ago. But if you think about how well we're doing on this case now, in another 20 years, we'd hope to be better still. We'd have many more of these validation studies. We'd know better about it. So should we be doing any cases now? And I think this is a question of ethics, of sort of professional ethics. And I think every linguist will have to come to their own conclusions, whether it's better to do what we can now, knowing it may be flawed, or to hold back until we've got more certainty with further research. But if we hold back, there's also an ethical downside that we may not be helping where we can. So these ethics questions are very real, as well as the actual methodological questions of how we should carry out an authorship analysis. So I realise I've covered a lot of ground quite fast. I've now got a slide for questions. So this is the shortened link where you can download the text. And also I've put this additional slide up. If you're interested in carrying out forensic linguistic analysis, we have a data repository for forensic linguistic texts that we run at Aston University. So if you want, it's multilingual, but dominated by English language texts. I don't believe we've got any Turkish language texts currently, but if you're looking for data for a project or an assessment and you want to use some forensic data, then you might want to look there to see if you can download some data sets that we've been developing. And if you want the book, you can download it from this link here, which I'll post in the chat afterwards as well. And that's my references there. So I hope I've left 10 minutes or so for questions as well. So I shall go back to there, and I think you can now see me again. So I'm very happy to take any questions or thoughts that people may have.
Of course. Anyone can ask questions.
So while waiting, I just want to thank you for your participation. We learned a lot, and I mentioned how much I love forensic linguistics to you before. So it means a lot to have you here. I just wanted to say thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm very pleased to be here.
Okay, Professor, would you like to take the textual questions by yourself, or should I?
I'm happy. Sorry, I can't see any. I've opened the chat function, but I can't see any questions there at the moment. Am I missing them?
For this moment, there's not any questions.
Okay, but I'm happy to take them. Either people put up their hands and you can ask them to speak, or to take them in the chat box.
Okay, Begum, you can speak or write your question.
Okay, Mr. Grant, thank you for the presentation. We were glad. So I have one question. There are two forensic authorship analysis approaches. So which one is better to carry out a forensic analysis? Thank you.
Okay, I think both types have strengths and weaknesses. And a lot of my research is trying to make stylistic methods more reliable, often by using computers in finding and extracting features, and also to make the heavily computational methods more explainable, less black box. So I think I said that, yes, there are these two approaches, but it's a bit more complicated. And I think if we can get that work in the middle right between the two, I think that's where we should be operating, where it should be better. I think both have their place and their role in different sorts of questions and different sorts of approaches. Very short texts are difficult for computational methods to work on. That's not true if you've got lots of them. So if you're analyzing Twitter or if you're analyzing SMS text messages, each text can be like 10 words or 5 words long or something like that, but you might have 500 of them. Yeah, so that's a lot of text you can work with. But if you've just got, an 100-word email compared with another 100-word email, it's quite hard to do a computational authorship analysis. It may be possible, not always. Short text is always a problem, but it can be easier to do a stylistic analysis, I suppose. Yeah, so it depends on the context, but also can we use the best of both sort of approaches is where I think we should be looking.
Thank you.
Okay, there is another question from Fatma Tunç. Can you?
So are you talking about readings and sources like that? So I've just put up the link to my book, which obviously I'm encouraging you to read. But in the references to that book, there's a lot of references to authorship analysis work as well. So that may be a place you can look. There is a very good introductory text by Malcolm Coulthard and Alison May and someone else, a third author. It's just called An Introduction to Forensic Linguistics, which I highly recommend as well. And there's a couple of other introductory texts that you could look at. But as I said, if you want sort of the nitty-gritty of authorship analysis type journal articles, my book refers to quite a lot of those. So the reference section of that might help. And someone else has asked a very similar question. If I can, while I'm talking, I will put a link up to the Coulthard book. Because I think that's probably the best general introduction to forensic linguistics. I've just because I've been fast, this is the book on the English version of the Amazon website. So you might not want to use that particular link, but that's the book that I'd recommend as a good starting place for people who've not come across the discipline before.
Do we have any other questions?
I have a question. Can I ask it? Before I ask my question, I would like to thank you for coming. My question was, you mentioned the Unabomber case being a documentary, but however, it was mostly fictional.
Yeah, it's not a documentary. It is a work of fiction from Hollywood.
It's a work of fiction.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, mixed it up.
Based on the truth, and Tim Fitzgerald advised on it. And the details of the linguistic analysis are accurate, but the story has a lot. So there's a love story. There's a love interest. There's a beautiful linguist who he goes to consult. In fact, the forensic linguist he went to consult was like a 50-year-old bloke from a university who looked a bit like me. And so wasn't the love interest that is depicted in the mini-series and so on. But the outline of the story is true, with some embellishment to make it into a good drama.
My question was, do you think the forensic linguistics is represented well in media or in any other cases?
That's an example. There are a few. So Jim Fitzgerald he was the FBI agent in the Unabomber case, and he moved to Hollywood, and he's responsible for forensic linguists appearing in the show Criminal Minds and in a couple of other shows. I don't know. I think it can be good for raising profile of that the discipline exists, but you shouldn't believe it all. And also, there's something about most actual criminal cases I've been involved in have been massive team efforts where there's no one discipline that solves a case, right? It's not like that. And if you have it's like there's a lot of forensic psychologists who are heroes of police dramas, right? And that's as unrealistic. Yeah, if forensic linguistics is depicted as being the thing that solves the case, it's probably not true, but it makes good television. So I think you have to be a bit careful, but I'm not saying it's a bad thing that there are representations. I think it's fun and it's good. Yes, you shouldn't think that the life of a forensic linguist as depicted in some of these dramas is how it is. You know, I'm a university professor and I like my job a lot, and that's the day job, marking student essays and teaching people and things like that. It's like I say, once in my now 20-something year career, have I had a ride in a fast police car, and that was right at the start. It's never happened again. Yeah, so you know, it's not like that, I think, is the answer. But that's not to say that, you know, I don't know, maybe some of you are writers of fiction or writers of television scripts. Put more forensic linguists in there. I think that's a good thing.
Thank you for answering my question.
No problem.
Okay, thank you again. Is there any other question or?
I have a question. Firstly, thank you for your presentation, Mr. Grant. So I want to ask, you mentioned about the use of computer programs and artificial intelligence in the psychometric authorship approach. And to what extent do you think artificial intelligence will affect linguistics or forensic linguistics in the near future? Can you comment on this?
Okay, so I think these approaches are bound to get better and better at identifying the authors of texts. Yeah, I think it's a task that's suited to that. But unless we can explain how they work, then they don't make good forensic evidence. Okay, so the research we're doing now is trying to answer that question. So I think we will use more and more heavily computational methods, And if you are like searching the whole internet for an individual using multi-search problem, the only thing you can do is heavily computational methods. And then you've got to look at the text and read them and say, well, does this look like a good match? How was it a good match? Yeah, so that's a different sort of level of problem. I mean, there's been a lot of publicity recently with these large language models like ChatGPT. And those which appear to produce flowing language, at least in languages which there's a lot of it on the internet, which is, it's not only English, but English, Spanish, and so on, where they can find lower levels of examples, like in the Turkish language, and you'd expect these models to work less well. Yeah, so there's AI is going to get better and better at that, at producing text, creating text, and giving the illusion it knows stuff and so on. But I think we can still detect whether a text has been produced by a computer or a human being and so on. Whether you can use it to, because one obvious thing that you could do if you were going to write a threatening communication is to tell ChatGPT what you want and get it to write the threatening communication. Yeah? So that will change the nature of forensic linguistics. Sorry, that shouldn't be giving out handy things like that, should I? But it's a sort of obvious way around forensic authorship analysis. The use of AI, which could get around it a bit.
Thank you for your answer.
Okay, Professor Grant, are you willing to accept any more questions, or we can close?
If there are questions. Someone's just put in the chat, exactly. Do we use these techniques while marking your students' writings? Usually, so we do get involved in plagiarism detection cases. So, if a student submits an essay, was it them who wrote it? Usually because some tutor is suspicious that it wasn't them. We sometimes get asked to look at cases like that. But no, not in the general marking of work. It's not quite what we do. But I'm happy to take any more questions, or if it's naturally wrapping up there, that's also good.
All right, then I will ask one question, if you will. How do you think, you partly answered this question already, but how do you think machine translation affects or will affect the analysis of the forensic text?
I think with all these, so one way of, again, trying to defeat authorship attribution is to put it through machine translation and then back translate it. So, for example, if you're writing in English, you could use Google Translate to put it into German and then back into English. You get a message that's slightly worded differently, and sometimes it makes no sense at all, but you've taken out your individual language style often. But with all these computational techniques, you can identify very often, not always, but very often, that it has been through some kind of computational process. Yeah, so you may not be able to identify who the original writer was, but you can say this is a computationally generated text or translated text or something of that sort. So at least you can say something about the text, even if it doesn't really solve the problem. The other area that one could talk about is that these computational methods tend to destroy the lower level language features, the word selection, the spelling errors, the grammatical structures, but the discourse structures and the pragmatic structures still remain. And so in some of the work we've done, we've focused on how you can use those sort of linguistic cues or clues to identify an author if the other stuff is destroyed or seems to be an attempt at disguise.
All right. Thank you for your great answer. If we don't have any questions, we can finish. I don't think there isn't any questions anymore.
Good. So thank you very much for inviting me once again. I've enjoyed presenting, and if you have any other questions or queries that people think, I'm happy to be emailed and so on. I can easily be found on the Aston University website, so I'm happy to engage. And at the beginning of the slide, my Twitter handle and other things were up there, so who can message me in a variety of ways.
Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for attending again to our linguistic workshop. We are honored, and thank you everyone for listening. It was a great presentation, Professor Grant. Thank you again, and we will add the links that you shared below the commentary section in YouTube, so they can be always reached. Okay, then thank you everyone. Have a great day.